After 3 very long years of saying I was gonna do this, welcome back to the channel formerly known as the Concert Vlogs, now reborn as me. For anyone who knows me, I cannot stop yapping about music. That is like all I talk about, and I've gotten to the point where everyone is a little sick of it. So if you're here, you seem to want to hear me yap about music, so enter at your own risk. Today, we are talking about concept albums. I think concept albums are a lost art form, which is shocking due to the fact that we are in an insane time of the rise of fascism and capitalism and where we are in the world. Concept albums tend to follow this idea of a post-apocalyptic world, or the rise of fascism, or the fall of it, or technology and how it's changing in our society. But a lot of these albums also tend to be quite Shakespearean in their own right, which is not uncommon for media. It's been used over and over and over again, and it never really gets old. I mean, I've watched 10 Things I Hate About You probably 45 times in my life, so. And of course, once an artist puts out their work into the world, it is up to the audience to interpret what it's about and take it into their own lives. But that does not mean the artists don't have a conceptual theme or storyline that they want the listeners to engage with. Without further ado, we will be going through my favorite concept albums. Starting off strong with David Bowie's The Rise and the Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. This album was released in 1972. Arguably, I'd say David Bowie is one of those artists that popularized the idea of concept albums and the concept of eras, if you will. I find Ziggy Stardust as a character to be a bit Christ-like, but in the sense that he's a bisexual spaceman sent to save the Earth from Mars. That sounds like my kind of Bible. Though, unlike Christ, Ziggy Stardust gets sucked into what I would call secularism of the human world. Ultimately, the mission fails. At the beginning of the album, I see Ziggy as this sort of amorphous character. So the first couple tracks is kind of the idea of Ziggy Stardust looking down on Earth as this orb and kind of having that desire to engage with humanity. His descent to Earth comes in the form of the tracks Moonage Daydream and Starman. And then as the album goes on, Ziggy falls from grace, if you will, in the perfectly flawed way that it means to be human. I do really love this Bowie album specifically because he took this character and bled it into the next era of Aladdin Sane. I find not many artists tend to continue their characters that they've created in concept albums, which is understandable. You know, a couple years go by, you're a different person. And I will say there's a little bit of homoeroticism on this album, and maybe that's part of the appeal. The first track of the album, 5 Years, has this commentary on humanity and how we're letting the world fall apart, and it does kind of remind me of that climate calendar that's going on, which, not to be dark, but it feels a little bit prophetic. This album dares to ask listeners, is somebody coming to save us in this world of rising late-stage capitalism and the decline of humanity and the disconnect between each other? And I think the album answers this question with only if we're open to care for each other and reconnect as human beings. This album ends on a hopeful note where it's kind of commenting on the fact if we put out empathy into the world, there's a way to exist peacefully. I have to honorably mention the undertones of there being a space war in this album. While the topic of the album is serious, I love that David Bowie plays with eccentricism and these campy little tidbits of lore within the album. This next album, I think, is quite predictable for me, but I don't think it's the predictable choice for this artist's conceptual albums that they have. This is My Chemical Romance, 3 Cheers for Sweet Revenge. This 2004 release has a bit of a Romeo and Juliet characterization, going back to the fact that Shakespearean references are all over media. I know. Most people would say The Black Parade is their most notable conceptual album, and sure. But I think 3 Cheers for Sweet Revenge is one of their most solid concepts, most solid storyline. I find The Black Parade has more of a fluid storyline where the characters aren't as concrete and evident to the fact that there is a storyline. Three Cheers for Sweet Revenge has this beautiful capacity to create movie scenes in your head where it feels cohesive and it follows a plot line, and that is something I very much enjoy in concept albums. The beginning of this record starts with a star-crossed couple known as the Demolition Lovers who die in a gunfight together. The first track and lead single of this album, Helena, is a funeral procession. At the end of the music video, you see this female character come back to life, and I think that's the key moment where the man realizes she's still alive. The man ultimately goes to hell and discovers that his true love is still alive on Earth and proceeds to make a deal with the devil. Predictable behavior for a man. The devil allows his return to Earth as long as he collects 1,000 souls to send back to hell. I picture the track Give 'Em Hell as this cinematic ascent from hell and just the beginning of this mission. And the story kind of travels through his experience within substance abuse and gang wars and violence and kind of a loss of humanity. Something questionable might have happened in that prison, but you tell me. I think a lot of the visual elements of this album is also very key to understanding the story. I do have the CD of this record, and the cover art is drawn by singer Gerard Way, and it's of these two demolition lovers so close to a kiss, and it feels poetic. The ascent from heaven feels a bit Grecian to me. If you talk about like Orpheus and Eurydice, it's a lot more violent. I think this album's great for hopeless romantics who like to lay in their bed and romanticize doomed love stories, and is that me? Maybe. This is a great record if you want an imaginable, very clear story. This album is extremely cohesive, even though there are, My Chemical Romance's version of ballads within the tracks. That is very nice to sit and pretend it's a movie. This album, I know for sure, is one of the best conceptual albums that has come out of the 2020s so far. Again, I think concept albums are a little bit of a lost art form that we should bring back, but I do know Ethel Cain has got me. This one is Preacher's Daughter by Ethel Cain. This album was released in 2022, which is kind of shocking to me that was only 3 years ago because it feels timeless. It feels like the cinematic universe has been around for so long. I think it's one of the most solid concept albums from the 21st century, point blank period. And it's taken form in this character of a Southern Gothic aesthetic. Honestly, I'd call Ethel Cain's music somewhere along the lines of dark folk or Gothic Americana, if that makes any sense. Ethel Cain as a project is inherently conceptual. It was created by Hayden Silas, influenced heavily by growing up in a religious Southern environment. Who can relate? Woo. I think this album is very similar to My Chemical Romance, where it does follow a very specific plot and multitude of characters. The main character is Ethel Cain, who lives in this cult-like religious community, and the album is set a few years after her father's death, and we will come back to that plot point because it is very important. The first couple tracks sort of set the tone for what the story is going to be. It gives us a bit of cultural context to her trials and tribulations growing up. It references a lot about family and the family tree. The first couple tracks, we lead into her perspective of living and being around criminal and abusive romantic partners. I find this album is a lot about Ethel's grappling with the dichotomy of family being blood and loyal to family, while also accepting the unacceptable. Finding out about her father abusing her, it leads a lot of context into why she's so loyal to her romantic partners. Once you hit the track Talamia, which is named after the 9th circle of hell from Dante's Inferno, genuinely, this song is one of the most horrifying songs I've ever heard in my life. Granted, I was driving through the woods in the middle of Kansas in the middle of the night, wasn't expecting those screams. Horrifying, but absolutely stunning. Quite literally very distant from being alive. I find there's something very connecting within the groans and separate voices and Ethel begging them to stop. Ethel is ultimately murdered by her partner, and from this point on in the album to the end, it's more so about what happens to her body and what she's seeing from beyond. I think Sunbleached Flies is quite a haunting song, and in Talamia as well, because you do hear the fly buzzing sounds, and it paint a very clear picture of a corpse. And in the final track, we do hear a monologue at the beginning of a sermon. I think this is a really interesting part of the album to interpret. I do think it leaves a gap for us to interpret sort of along the lines, is she in heaven or is she in hell? Because her father was a preacher, and why would she be hearing his voice from beyond the grave? I think that's a really fascinating, very fluid ending to the story. This last track also lets us know that her former partner does cannibalize her. While this concept album, unlike most, is not about the general consensus of the world ending, it is about a girl and her trials and tribulations and her world ending. Next up, OK Computer by Radiohead. I know OK Computer is not technically their concept album. I know Kid A is their concept album. But let a girl dream, because I think it is. Also, I like this album a bit more than Kid A. Sue me. Obviously, Kid A is one of the most influential and popular concept album of probably all time. I think OK Computer is a lot more fascinating about the relationships of humanity and technology, or more so the potential of technology. Something I will give Radiohead credit for being a bit of geniuses is their ability to contrast both acoustic and electric features that are still complementary but drastically different. I think Karma Police is a great example because you have these sort of sighing effects, if that makes any sense, but it's mismatched with these very aggressive distorted guitars that are swelling and becoming cinematic. The title of this record does come from A Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It follows that dystopian storyline of technology and where the hell is it going? This album is one of those concept albums that isn't a direct plot. The album kind of goes through the rise and the ultimate failure of technology and how we interact with it as human beings. References to car crashes in Airbag and plane crashes in Lucky. I take this album as more of a prophecy to the impending flaws of using technology and how we interact with it as a society. I will bring up an album later that feels like this concept flipped on its head, more so where we are now, rather than prophetic look into the future of what technology could be. This album feels like you're simultaneously floating in space, but also horrifically drowning with existential dread. While there are a lot of artists that are technically very good and know music theory and know how music works, but ultimately don't have that soul feeling, I won't name any names, but it's quite rare that artists can have these technical pieces and slot them together and know what they're doing while keeping that soul and that emotion, and this album is just the perfect medium. It's possible to talk about concept albums without talking about Radiohead. And while Kid A is a concept album, I find the band themselves is a conceptual project, and that concept feels more sonic than thematic. Listening back to this album, where we're in a day and age of the rise of AI, to put my tinfoil hat on, but we are losing the ability to function like human beings and create things because of the technological tools we have at our disposal. And this album feels like a warning against that, and maybe it's worth a listen again. Beat it into your head. Don't use AI. Please. Also, there is a reason Exit Music was TikTokified. That song, if there's ever a movie made about me, but why would there be? That's my ending track. Going out in a blaze of glory. On the same theme, we're moving on to our final album, A Brief Inquiry into Online Relationships by the 1975. Now, this album feels like a very clear reference to OK Computer. I don't really care what Maddie Healy has to say about it. As I mentioned before, OK Computer feels like a forewarning or a possible predictable event. But A Brief Inquiry feels more so what is happening now rather than what is possibly going to happen. And it's tough. And it's tough. I think this album's a great play on the devastating weight that it feels to be in a modern world with social media and technological advances, and also needing a sense of control. My personal favorite track on the album is one of the singles, Love It If We Made It. This record came out in 2018, which was a couple years after Donald Trump got elected. I was going into my last year of high school. I was very politically aware. Call me a blue-haired social justice warrior. I don't care. Love It If We Made It and I Like America and America Likes Me felt very pivotal to me in that political sphere, and growing up in a impending fascist and violent community. Love It If We Made It specifically is full of quotes from Donald Trump himself to things ripped straight from headlines. I think it's a great take on how difficult it is to keep up with everything going on in our world because we have it at our fingertips with social media, and wanting to be just to the world and have empathy for every cause, but how tiring it can be. I'd call it a bit of a cultural paralysis, if you will. Sincerity is Scary is another honorable mention for me on this record. I think it is so true that sincerity is scary these days because we are following these rules of social media. Can I text 3 times in a row? How long do I have to wait to text? Yada, yada, yada. I think it's a little bit of bullshit, but I also follow these rules because it's become the cultural social norm. I know there are some specific critiques on this album, specifically the song A Man Who Married a Robot. A lot of people find that this is too force-fed and hits the nail on the head too hard and is too obvious to listeners and makes them feel stupid. While I think that's a valid criticism, at least viewing it from a 2025 lens, I think it's indicative of how docile human beings have become and how much we need to be force-fed when we have this age of AI where there's a lack of critical thinking. Inside Your Mind is one of my favorite songs off this record. There's something so raw to me about the lyrics, want to rip you open and see what's inside of your mind. Maybe it's just a girl liking cannibalism as a metaphor for love. Maybe it is. But it's quite beautiful to have that desire to want to know what's going on with a romantic partner or whoever's in your life, and to the degree where you want to climb inside of their body. I think this is a huge Radiohead reference. You have vocoders and different beeps and boops, contrasted by these sort of ballads where Healy is just sitting down at a piano and singing a song. Those moments of calmness that are sprinkled in between these very aggressive electronic tracks feels grounding and feels important to the theme of the dichotomy between humanity and technology. Half of this album is quite angry in a way that I don't think is expected. You've got these dance tracks with lyrics that are kind of crazy angry at the world, but you do still have those moments of calmness and self-reflection. I think it's important to be angry, but I think it is also important to ground yourself as we go through the world with technological advancements, and they're right. Sincerity is scary in this world, and the world is scary, and where we're going with it is scary, but again, live your life with care for humanity. I will say this album also reminds me of the movie Her. Maybe it's just the monologue portion of A Man Who Married a Robot, but I don't know. I'm really hoping concept albums come back in a major way, and I have a feeling within the next couple years they will. There's a lot to talk about. There's a lot going on in the world that is quite scary and apocalyptic. I think concept albums are going to be so back. Concept albums are in for 2025, for me personally. If you made it this long listening to my voice, thank you. I appreciate it. I will be back at some point when I have more music things to yap about. And my professors always told me not to end a presentation on so yeah. So, yeah.